Picture this. It's 2 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, that's never a good start.
Right. You have this massive presentation due in exactly 6 hours. Or maybe, you're putting the final touches on a master's thesis that has basically consumed the last 2 years of your life.
The stakes are incredibly high.
Exactly. High stakes. So you reach over to grab your coffee, your elbow grazes the power cord, and the screen just flickers.
Yeah.
Then it just goes completely black. You just freeze. The only sound in the room is like your own heartbeat.
Absolute silence.
Right. So you reach out, your fingers trembling just a little bit, and you press the power button on the computer case. You hear the fan spin up, you see a little LED light flicker on the front, and then, well, nothing.
Just nothing.
The screen stays pitch black. There's no error message, no helpful little pop-up, just a dead, silent void. That feeling right there in the pit of your stomach, that is absolute, unfiltered diagnostic panic.
It really is a terrifying moment. And, I mean, it's terrifying mostly because of the complete loss of agency.
Yeah, you just feel helpless.
Exactly. We interact with these machines all day, every day, right? But the moment they stop behaving exactly as we expect, we realize we actually have absolutely no idea what is happening inside the box.
Which is exactly why I wanted to dive into today's material for this deep dive. Because usually when we talk about diagnosing a problem, like, say, a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision.
Like a structured engineering approach.
Right. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at the film and says, well, there it is.
Yeah, it's visible. It's neatly categorized as broken or not broken. It's a localized problem with a clear physical mechanism.
But when you step into the world of computer hardware troubleshooting, especially when you're just staring at a blank screen, that x-ray machine is completely broken. You're blind to what is happening beneath the surface unless you know exactly where to look.
You're navigating in the dark.
Exactly. So the mission for today's deep dive is to basically build that x-ray machine for you. We are going to pull back the curtain on that invisible layer of technology that sits between you, the user, and the raw electrical components of your computer.
And we are pulling our insights today directly from, well, the foundational bedrock of IT troubleshooting.
Straight from the source.
Right. The material we're analyzing is derived from the core technical training modules used to certify actual IT professionals. Specifically, it's the methodology for diagnosing hardware and system-level failures.
But, and I think this is the most important thing to establish right up front, this isn't just some boring study guide for someone sitting in a freezing server room somewhere.
No, the principles here are entirely universal.
Yeah, this is the ultimate survival guide for anyone who has ever stared helplessly at a blank monitor. I mean, we all rely entirely on these machines for our livelihoods, our creativity, our connection.
Yeah, we treat them like magic boxes.
We really do. We put our intentions in, and we just expect productivity to magically come out. And when the magic stops, the immediate assumption is that the box is just permanently broken, and we need to drop, I don't know, $2,000 on a brand new one.
Which is a completely understandable reaction, honestly, if you view the computer as a single monolithic entity.
Right.
But it isn't. A computer is, at its core, a strictly logical chain of command. It's a cascading sequence of events.
A chain reaction.
Exactly. If you understand how that chain works, you can isolate absolutely any problem. The failure is never just arbitrary. It always happens at a very specific link in the chain.
So let's follow that chain, starting from the absolute beginning. Because before Windows or Mac OS ever even loads, before you see your desktop background or your login screen, there's a gatekeeper.
The very first link.
Right. When you press that power button, you aren't actually turning on the operating system. You are turning on the system firmware.
Yes, the firmware. For decades, this was universally known as the BIOS.
Your BIOS, right.
Yeah, and in modern machines, it has evolved into the UEFI. But fundamentally, this is a tiny, incredibly robust piece of software physically embedded on a memory chip, right on the motherboard itself.
It's built right into the hardware.
Exactly. It's the very first thing that wakes up when electricity hits the system.
And getting access to this firmware is, well, it's the first major hurdle for a lot of people. The sources we're looking at explain that to get into this setup program, this secret menu where you can actually control the raw hardware, you have to press a specific keyboard prompt incredibly early during the boot process.
Yes, the classic interrupt keys.
Right. Usually it's delete or F2, sometimes F10 or maybe escape. But anyone who has bought a computer in, the last 5 years knows this struggle.
Oh, it's nearly impossible now.
It's like trying to catch your exit on a high-speed freeway in the pouring rain. You press the power button, and a fraction of a second later, the Windows logo is already spinning. You end up just mashing the F2 key like a maniac, hoping to catch the window, and you almost always miss it.
You're just hammering the keyboard.
Exactly. So why is it so incredibly difficult now? Why did we lose that deliberate pause the computer used to take?
It's actually a fascinating consequence of our own demand for instant gratification. That, combined with a pretty radical shift in storage technology.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, to understand why you can't hit F2 in time anymore, we have to look at the physical architecture of hard drives. In the past, computers booted from mechanical hard disk drives, or HDDs.
The old chunky ones.
Right. These were physical metal platters spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute, with a tiny mechanical arm moving back and forth just to find the boot files.
Basically like a record player.
Exactly like a highly advanced record player. And because that mechanical movement took actual physical time, the drive had to physically spin up to speed, and the arm had to seek the data.
So there was a natural delay built in.
Yes, the system naturally had a delay. The firmware would put up a screen that said, press F2 for setup, and it would just wait for the hard drive to get ready.
But today we don't have those spinning plates.
No, today we use solid-state drives, or SSDs. There are 0 moving parts. It is purely electrical.
Just chips.
Right. NAND flash memory uses trapped electrons to store data. So accessing that data happens basically at the speed of electrical transmission.
So the storage became so fast that the firmware, it just didn't need to wait around anymore.
Exactly. And hardware manufacturers realized that consumers were judging the quality of a new computer by how fast it booted up.
Obviously, we want it fast.
So they implemented these fast boot protocols directly into the UEFI. The firmware now skips several exhaustive hardware checks and just pulls the operating system into memory almost instantaneously.
Wow.
The window of time where the motherboard is actively listening for your keyboard input over the USB controller is reduced to literally milliseconds. The machine is actively bypassing human reaction time just to get you to your desktop faster.
Which is, fantastic when you're just trying to check your email in a hurry. But it is a massive roadblock when your computer's acting up and you actually need to fix something.
It's a huge frustration for troubleshooting, yeah.
But thankfully, the material provides alternative methods to bypass this race. If you're on a modern operating system like Windows 10 or 11, you don't actually have to play the F2 mashing game.
You can just ask the OS to do it for you.
Exactly. You can use advanced startup options. You are basically leaving a note for the operating system that says, hey, next time you go to sleep and wake up, don't rush straight back here. Take me to the secret menu.
Right. It's a deliberate handoff from the operating system back down to the firmware level.
Now, the traditional way to do this involves a lot of clicking. You go to Settings, then Update and Security, then Recovery, click Advanced Startup, then Troubleshoot, and finally, click UEFI Firmware Settings.
It's a bit buried.
It's incredibly buried. It works, but it's tedious. But here's the trick that I think is just a total lifesaver, and everyone listening should commit this to memory. There is a shortcut.
Oh, yes? The shift trick.
Yes. You just open your Start menu, click the power icon, and then hold down the Shift key on your keyboard while you click Restart.
It is incredibly elegant.
It's so simple. What's actually happening there?
By holding that Shift key, you're sending a software interrupt to the standard reboot protocol. Windows intercepts that command and says, okay, the user wants the diagnostic environment.
That makes sense.
It bypasses the fast boot sequence entirely for that one specific restart cycle.
But the sources also give us a command line override, which I have to admit looks completely intimidating at first glance.
It does look like hacker syntax to most people.
Yeah, exactly. If you open up the command prompt in Windows, you can type this very specific string of letters to force the machine into this menu. The command is shutdown, ROFT0. Now, to a lot of people, that just looks like pure gibberish. I know what shutdown means, but what is the rest of that actually doing to the machine?
Well, it's actually a beautifully logical set of instructions once you break it down. It is the purest way to speak directly to the operating system's kernel. The base command is indeed shutdown, which is the executable program you're calling into action. But those letters following the forward slashes, those are parameters, often called flags.
So they're like modifiers.
Exactly. You are giving the shutdown program highly specific modifiers.
Okay, break them down for me. What does the R do?
The R flag tells the program to restart the system, rather than just powering it down completely to a halt.
Got it. And the O?
The O is the critical flag for our purposes today. That stands for Options. It instructs the system to halt at that advanced boot options menu rather than loading the regular operating system again.
Ah, okay. And the F?
That stands for force.
Force, like forcefully closing things.
Precisely. This is crucial if a system is locking up. Normally, when you try to restart, Windows very politely asks every running application to save its data and close.
Right, you get that screen that says, waiting for programs to close.
Exactly. But if an application is frozen, say, a rogue web browser process, the restart will just hang indefinitely. The F flag tells the kernel to aggressively terminate all running applications immediately. No warnings, no asking for permission.
It's just pulling the plug on the software side.
Yes. And finally, you have the T0. That is the time parameter. You're setting the countdown timer to 0 seconds.
0 patience.
Right. You are telling the machine, execute this entire sequence of force commands right this absolute millisecond.
I really appreciate that breakdown because it changes how you view the command line. You aren't just typing magic spells, you are giving the machine a highly structured sentence.
It's a very clear instruction.
You're taking the power back from its automated startup sequence. You're saying, stop what you are doing, force close everything that is broken, and take me straight to the motherboard.
You are asserting control over that chain of command. You're actively bypassing the automated convenience features that, over the years, have obscured the underlying mechanics of the system.
So, let's say we successfully execute that command, or we use the shift restart trick, and we find ourselves dropping through that secret gateway. We are now staring at the system firmware menu. What exactly are we looking at?
Well, you're looking at the foundation.
Right. And the material spends a significant amount of time detailing the evolution of this interface, contrasting the old era with the new era. It explores the transition from the legacy BIOS to the modern UEFI and how that shift completely revolutionized how computers handle storage.
Yeah, this transition is arguably one of the most critical structural changes in the history of personal computing hardware.
It's that big of a deal.
Oh, absolutely.
Uh-huh.
We are talking about replacing a foundational architecture that governed systems for over 30 years.
Let's paint a picture of that old system first for the listener. The legacy BIOS, which stands for Basic Input-Output System.
Yes.
If you used a computer in the 90s or early 2000s, you definitely remember this screen. It was usually this harsh, bright blue or pitch black background with very blocky, jagged white or yellow text.
Very retro.
And you couldn't use your mouse. The mouse was completely dead. You had to navigate this labyrinth of technical menus using only the arrow keys on your keyboard. And you hit enter to change a value. It genuinely felt like you were hacking into a mainframe in like a Cold War movie.
And it functioned very much like one. The legacy BIOS was incredibly robust for its time, but it was fundamentally limited by the mathematical reality of the era in which it was created.
Mathematical reality.
Yes. As technology advanced, particularly the physical capacity of hard drives, the BIOS transformed from a reliable foundation into a severe, immovable bottleneck. And the most glaring limitation was its reliance on a storage formatting system known as MBR. Right, the master boot record. The sources outline some very strict limitations here. MBR capped out at a maximum drive size of exactly 2 terabytes. It also only allowed you to carve the drive up into a maximum of 4 primary partitions.
Very restrictive by today's standards. Extremely. And crucially, it located all of its critical boot information, like the map of where the operating system actually lives in the very first physical sector of the drive. Now, I have to stop here and push back a little because this is a concept that has always seemed completely counterintuitive to me.
Okay, what's the hang up?
Why does a tiny firmware chip on the motherboard care how physically large my hard drive is? I always thought managing files and folders and storage space was Windows' job. Why was the BIOS physically fundamentally incapable of seeing a hard drive that was larger than 2 terabytes? Was it just an arbitrary software block?
It was not arbitrary at all. It is a physical math problem rooted directly in how computers address memory.
Okay, lay it on me.
Yeah. It all comes down to the difference between 32-bit architecture and 64-bit architecture. To understand why a 2 terabyte wall exists, you have to visualize how a hard drive actually stores data.
Okay, I'm visualizing.
Imagine a massive grid of mailboxes stretching out to the horizon. That entire grid is your hard drive. The drive is divided into millions of tiny, identical compartments called sectors.
Mailboxes.
Got it. In the traditional standard, every single one of those sectors, or mailboxes, held exactly 512 bytes of data. Now, for the processor to find a specific file, say a photograph from your vacation, it needs to know exactly which mailboxes hold that data. It needs an address for each individual sector.
That makes perfect sense. The post office needs an address to deliver the mail.
Exactly. Now, the legacy BIOS and the MBR system were built on a 32-bit numerical system. That means the addresses it assigned to those mailboxes were created using 32 binary digits, just a string of 32 ones and zeros.
Okay.
Now, if you calculate the absolute maximum number of unique combinations you can make with exactly 32 binary digits, you get exactly 2 to the power of 32.
Which is how many? I don't have a calculator handy.
It is 4,294,967,296.
Over 4 billion.
Right. That is the absolute maximum number of unique addresses the BIOS can possibly generate. It simply runs out of numbers after that. There are no more combinations of ones and zeros left in 32 bits.
Wow, okay.
Now, if you take that maximum number of addressable sectors, that 4.2 billion, and multiply it by the physical size of each sector, which, as we established, is 512 bytes, the resulting math maxes out at roughly 2.2 terabytes of data.
Oh, wow. So it literally ran out of mathematical vocabulary.
Precisely. If you took a modern, massive 8-terabyte hard drive and plugged it into an old legacy BIOS motherboard, the system would map out the first 2.2 terabytes, hit its numerical limit of 4.2 billion addresses, and just stop.
It wouldn't crash.
No, it wouldn't crash, but it simply lacked the mathematical language to acknowledge that the remaining 5.8 terabytes of the physical disk even existed. To the BIOS, the rest of the drive was literally invisible space.
That is fascinating. The hardware was completely capable, but the foundational math of the firmware hit a hard wall, which explains exactly why the industry was forced to invent UEFI.
Yes, the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. UEFI natively utilizes a 64-bit architecture, and moving from 32-bit addressing to 64-bit addressing doesn't just double the capacity, it expands it exponentially. 2 to the power of 64 gives you a number so unfathomably large that we will likely not hit the storage ceiling for centuries.
And with this new UEFI math came a completely new way to format the drives themselves, moving away from that old master boot record to something called GPT.
The GOAD partition table.
Right. And the materials note that GPT completely shatters those old limits. Not only does it support drives with those massive capacities we just talked about, but instead of being limited to just 4 primary partitions, a GPT drive can be sliced into 128 partitions natively in Windows.
It's a massive expansion of flexibility.
It is. But what I find even more impressive isn't just the sheer scale, it is the fundamental shift in how it handles system stability and corruption.
Yes, if we look closely at the architecture, the move to GPT was fundamentally a move towards survivability.
Survivability.
Think about it. Do you recall where we said MBR stored as boot information?
Yes, the sources said it stored everything in the very first sector of the drive, the absolute front of the line.
Right. And that design created a terrifying single point of failure.
Yeah.
The master boot record is literally the map that tells the computer where the operating system is located. Because it only exists in that one single location, Sector 0, it was incredibly vulnerable.
Vulnerable to what? Exactly.
If your house experiences a tiny power surge right as the drive is reading that sector, or, if the magnetic platter develops a microscopic scratch exactly in that one spot, the entire map is completely obliterated.
And what happens to the computer when you try to turn it on?
The computer turns on, looks at Sector 0, finds garbage data, and halts. It just throws an operating system not found error.
Wow.
Your data, your photos, your documents, all of it is still sitting perfectly safe on the rest of the drive, but the computer's gone entirely blind to it because the one and only map was destroyed.
That is such a terrible design flaw. It's like having a giant fortified bank vault, but you keep the only key taped to the outside of the front door, and if it rains, the key just melts.
It is an incredibly apt analogy. And GPT solves this exact vulnerability by introducing structural redundancy.
How does it do that?
Well, it still stores a partition table at the beginning of the disk so the system can boot quickly, but it also silently writes a secondary backup copy of the entire partition table at the absolute end of the physical disk.
Oh, that's smart.
It also utilizes mathematical checksums to constantly verify that the data in those tables is actually accurate.
So it has built-in insurance.
Exactly. If a power surge corrupts the primary header at the beginning of the drive, the UEFI boot process detects the mathematical error, automatically navigates to the end of the drive, retrieves the backup map, repairs the primary map, and boots the system seamlessly.
So the user wouldn't even know.
The user might never know a catastrophic error was just averted.
That is brilliant engineering. And just to visually contrast this for the user, when you boot into a modern UEFI screen today, it looks and feels like a modern application.
It does. It's very polished.
Right, because it has that 64-bit backbone, you have full use of your mouse. The interfaces are often slick and highly graphical. You might have a dashboard showing your CPU temperatures in real time, with visual dials that literally look like the dashboard of a sports car.
It's a completely different world from the jagged blue text of the legacy era.
Completely different, though the materials do point out a feature called CSM, or Compatibility Support Module, which allows a modern UEFI motherboard to essentially put on a disguise and pretend it is an old legacy BIOS.
Which is a necessary bridge for enterprise environments.
Why would they want to go backward?
Sometimes a massive corporation has a highly specific piece of industrial hardware or a legacy operating system that mathematically requires that old MBR standard. CSM allows you to run that ancient tech on brand new hardware by artificially enforcing those old 32-bit limits. That makes sense. But the evolution to UEFI wasn't just about expanding storage limits or giving us a nice graphical interface with mouse support. The deeper we get into this material, the more it becomes clear that UEFI fundamentally changed the nature of computer security.
Yes, drastically.
It transitioned the firmware from being just a simple traffic cop that points the way to Windows into a highly militarized frontline defense for your entire digital life.
This is perhaps the most significant conceptual shift in modern computing architecture.
Really?
A most significant.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because historically, we have treated security as a software problem. You boot up Windows, and then you run an antivirus program inside Windows to protect you.
Right, you get your McAfee or Norton pop-ups.
Exactly. But the problem with that paradigm is that if a threat compromises the system before Windows loads, your antivirus software is completely useless. The UEFI evolution shifted security down to the physical hardware level.
And the centerpiece of this hardware-level defense, according to the sources, is a feature natively built into UEFI called Secure Boot. The outline explains that when Secure Boot is enabled, the motherboard will only boot software, like the operating system loader and the foundational drivers, if that software has been signed by a trusted cryptographic certificate.
It acts as a strict verification system.
Right. It blocks invalid signatures, which completely prevents highly advanced malware from taking over the machine. When I read this, the immediate image that came to mind was a bouncer at a wildly exclusive nightclub.
I like that. Let's explore that.
Let's say the operating system is the VIP room. Secure Boot is the enormous bouncer standing outside the physical building, checking IDs before anyone even gets near the VIP section. If your digital certificate isn't on his clipboard, he physically blocks the door. You don't get in.
I really like that analogy because it emphasizes the preemptive nature of the security.
Yeah.
The bouncer isn't waiting inside the club to see if someone starts causing trouble. He prevents them from ever crossing the threshold. And to fully grasp why this hardware bouncer is so vital, we have to explore the sheer terror of what it is actually designed to stop, the rootkit.
The sources mention rootkits specifically. What exactly makes a rootkit so much more dangerous than, a standard computer virus you might accidentally download in a shady email attachment?
It comes down to privilege and sequence. A standard computer virus operates within the rules set by the operating system. It might delete files or replicate itself, sure, but it is ultimately subject to the operating system's authority.
It's still playing the game.
Right. But a rootkit is designed to subvert the operating system itself by loading into the system memory before the operating system even begins to boot.
So it beats Windows to the punch.
Exactly. In computer science, we talk about rings of privilege, where ring 0 is the deepest, most authoritative level of access to the hardware. A rootkit infects the boot sector of the storage drive and establishes itself at that ring 0 level.
And what does that let it do?
Once it is entrenched there, it essentially sets the rules of reality for the operating system that loads above it.
What do you mean by rules of reality?
Okay, think about this. If you have a rootkit and you open your antivirus software inside Windows and you click Scan, the antivirus sends a request down to the hardware asking, hey, are there any malicious files hidden here?
Right, checking the drive.
But the rootkit, because it controls the flow of information between the hardware and the OS, intercepts that question. It looks at the malicious files, actively hides them from the scam, and replies to the antivirus, nope, the drive is completely clean.
That is terrifying. It literally intercepts the security cameras and feeds them a looped video of an empty hallway.
Precisely. You cannot trust a software-based security tool to find a threat that has compromised the very foundation the software runs on. This is exactly why Secure Boot was invented.
How does Secure Boot catch it?
Because a rootkit has to modify the bootloader to execute its code, it physically alters the mathematical structure of that file. When Secure Boot is active, the UEFI motherboard checks the digital cryptographic signature of the bootloader.
The ID check.
Right. It performs a complex mathematical hash. If a rootkit has altered even a single line of code in that boot file, the resulting hash will not match the trusted certificate stored in the motherboard.
The signature is broken.
Yes. The bouncer looks at the ID, realizes it is a fake, and completely halts the boot process. The motherboard just refuses to hand over control to the corrupted drive, stopping the ring 0 infection dead in its tracks.
It's a literal quarantine enforced by the silicon itself. And, this concept of silicon-level security ties directly into another major feature detailed in our material, the TPM, or Trusted Platform Module.
Specifically TPM version 2.0.
Right. The sources define this as a physical hardware chip that securely stores cryptographic keys, digital certificates, and hashed passwords. It is the engine that enables heavy encryption features like Microsoft's BitLocker, and it provides what the material calls hardware-based attestation.
It's a very robust system.
No, I know the basic difference between software and hardware, but why is it so vital that these cryptographic keys are stored on a separate, dedicated physical chip? Why couldn't Windows just keep the encryption keys locked away in a hidden folder on the hard drive?
Because if the key is stored on the hard drive, it is theoretically accessible to anyone who possesses the physical drive.
Okay, but it's hidden, right?
Hidden isn't enough. Imagine you have a highly sensitive laptop and you use software to encrypt all the data. If a corporate spy steals that laptop, pulls the physical hard drive out, and plugs it into their own sophisticated hacking rig, they have infinite time to run automated attacks against the software to extract the key.
Oh, because they have physical control of the drive.
Exactly. Because the key is sitting right there on the same disk as the locked data. It's like locking a safe, but taping the combination to the bottom of the safe.
Okay, so how does the TPM actually change that dynamic?
A TPM is a dedicated, highly secure crypto processor. It's physically soldered directly onto the motherboard of the computer.
It's a permanent fixture.
It is a literal microscopic vault built right into the hardware. When you encrypt your hard drive with BitLocker, the cryptographic key required to unscramble your data is not stored on the hard drive at all. It is sealed deep inside the TPM chip on the motherboard.
So the lock is on the drive, but the key is physically trapped on the board.
Exactly. When you press the power button, the TPM executes that hardware-based attestation you mentioned. It actively analyzes the entire boot sequence. It checks the UEFI settings. It checks Secure Boot. It verifies that the operating system hasn't been tampered with.
It's doing a full inspection.
Yes. It asks the system, are you in the exact same pristine, secure state you were in when I was locked? If the system passes that rigorous physical interrogation, the TPM releases the key into the volatile memory, and the drive decrypts.
And if the thief pulls the drive out and puts it in their own computer?
The drive remains completely encrypted gibberish. The new computer's motherboard doesn't have the original TPM chip, so it obviously doesn't have the key.
Right.
And if the thief tries to boot the stolen laptop with a malicious USB drive to bypass Windows, the TPM detects that the boot sequence has been altered. The attestation fails, and the TPM refuses to release the key. The data remains completely locked.
This explains so much about the massive uproar a few years ago. I remember when Microsoft announced Windows 11, the tech community practically rioted because Microsoft mandated that every single computer must have a physical TPM 2.0 chip installed and activated just to run the operating system.
Oh, the backlash was severe.
People were furious because their slightly older machines, which were perfectly fast and capable, were suddenly deemed obsolete simply because they lacked this one specific microchip.
The pushback was intense and honestly understandably frustrating for consumers. But from the perspective of enterprise security architecture, Microsoft's decision was a profound, completely necessary paradigm shift.
You think it was the right call?
They drew a definitive line in the sand. They looked at the exploding threat landscape of ransomware, rootkits, and highly sophisticated state-sponsored malware, and realized that relying on users to voluntarily install software security was just no longer sufficient.
They had to force the issue.
By forcing TPM 2.0 as a baseline hardware requirement, they forced the entire PC ecosystem to share the burden of security at the physical layer.
The outline also briefly mentions a hardware security module, or HSM, which acts similarly but is a removable USB device. It stores keys but allows you to physically carry them in your pocket, which feels very much like something out of a spy thriller.
Oh, definitely. Very James Bond.
You plug the physical key into the server, and only then does the data decrypt. But speaking of USBs, there is one more security feature embedded in the UEFI that I think is incredibly clever, and it relies on raw electrical control rather than complex cryptography. The material outlines firmware passwords and USB permissions.
Yes, the administrative control over the motherboard interfaces. This is highly effective.
Right. It notes you can set a supervisor password, which locks the UEFI menu itself so a malicious actor can't just boot in and turn secure boot off. You can also set a user password, which locks the entire system pre-boot. You literally can't get past a black screen to even load Windows without typing the password.
A very solid physical barrier.
But the USB permissions are what really caught my attention. The sources state that a system administrator can go into the UEFI and completely disable the USB ports at the motherboard level. When I read this, my first thought was that it's like digitally supergluing the USB ports shut. But how does that actually work? If I plug a mouse into a port that has been disabled in the UEFI, does Windows just ignore it?
It is much deeper than Windows just ignoring it. To understand this, we have to look at the physical pins inside a standard USB port. A classic USB-A port has exactly 4 metal pins inside.
Okay, 4 pins.
2 pins are for data transmission, sending the ones and zeros back and forth. 1 pin is a ground wire, and the final pin is a 5-volt electrical power line that provides actual juice to whatever you plug in.
Okay, so it supplies both data and electricity.
Correct. Now, when an administrator goes into the UEFI and disables the USB ports, they aren't just telling a software driver to ignore the port. The UEFI firmware literally commands the motherboard's USB controller chip to sever the electrical routing to those specific physical ports.
Wait, it actually cuts the power?
It cuts the 5-volt power line entirely, and it disables the data channels at the hardware level.
So the port is physically dead.
It is entirely inert. It is just a piece of plastic and, dormant metal. You could plug a flash drive loaded with the most devastating advanced malware on the planet into that port, and absolutely nothing will happen.
Because it has no power.
Exactly. The flash drive will not receive the electricity required to even turn its own memory chips on.
That is an incredibly brilliant move for corporate espionage protection. I instantly thought of a kiosk at a mall, or a computer sitting in a public library, or even a teller's computer at a bank.
Public-facing machines are highly vulnerable.
Exactly. If you have a public-facing machine, you don't want a random person walking up, plugging in a tiny thumb drive loaded with a portable hacking OS, and just hijacking the machine while the teller is looking away.
It happens faster than you'd think.
By severing that electrical connection in the firmware, you neutralize the physical attack vector entirely.
It is the ultimate application of the principle of least privilege applied to physical hardware. You only grant the system the exact capabilities it absolutely requires to perform its specific job, and you mercilessly shut down every other potential vector of attack.
Okay, so at this point in our chain of command, we have established the firmware as an incredibly powerful, highly secure gatekeeper. We know how to access it, we understand the mathematical leap from the legacy 32-bit BIOS to the modern 64-bit UEFI, and we understand how it locks down the system physically and cryptographically.
We've covered the digital logic.
But all of this firmware logic relies on the assumption that the physical components of the computer are actually functioning. What happens when things get physical? What happens when the machine just refuses to wake up at all?
The hardware layer.
That brings us to the next massive area of troubleshooting, the engine room. We are looking at thermodynamics, electrical power, and the dreaded diagnostic nightmare known as no-post.
This is a critical pivot in our diagnostic methodology. We are transitioning away from digital logic and cryptography and moving firmly into the realm of raw physics. Before any software, even the UEFI, can execute, the hardware components must be thermodynamically safe and electrically stable.
Let's start with the thermodynamics, the cooling. A computer is essentially a massive space heater that happens to do math.
That's a very accurate description.
The CompTIA A material notes that within that UEFI interface we've been discussing, the user has granular control over the system's fan speed profiles. You can choose basic presets like silent, balanced, or performance, but it also details the ability to set custom fan curves, where the exact RPMs, the revolutions per minute of the cooling fans, are tied directly to specific temperature thresholds of the processor.
It allows for fine-tuning.
I love this concept because it strips away the digital magic and makes the computer feel like an internal combustion engine. You're literally tuning the idle speed of the radiator fans.
And just like tuning an engine, it requires a precise balance. The fans in a computer use a technology called PWM, or pulse width modulation.
What does that mean in practice?
The motherboard sends rapid electrical pulses to the fan motor to dictate its exact speed. You go into the UEFI and set the fans to run at 100% capacity at all times. The internal components of your system will be ice cold.
Which sounds good for the computer.
Yes, but the consequence is that your computer will sound like a jet turbine taking off on your desk. And the physical bearings inside those fan motors will grind down and fail prematurely due to constant maximum strain.
Oh, so the fan curve is about finding efficiency, balancing heat and noise.
Exactly. A custom fan curve allows the system to remain whisper quiet, running the fans at maybe 20% speed while you are performing low-intensity tasks like reading emails or typing a document.
But then when you game,
Right. The curve is programmed to monitor the thermal sensors embedded inside the CPU silicon. The moment that silicon hits a specific threshold, say 75 degrees Celsius because you just initiated a complex 4K video render, the UEFI detects that thermal spike. It instantly ramps the fan PWM signals up to 80% or 90% to aggressively exhaust that heat out of the case before the processor physically damages itself.
and the sources mentioned you can monitor these specific temperatures manually while sitting in the BIOS, or via third-party software sensors once Windows loads, or even using physical thermal gauges if you have a highly modified case.
People get very serious about thermal management.
They really do. But let's step away from tuning a working system. Let's talk about power troubleshooting. We are back to that initial terrifying scenario. You press the power button on the case and the fans don't spin, the lights don't come on, the machine is completely, utterly dead.
A total failure to launch.
The material lays out a methodology for diagnosing this, and honestly, it highlights the absolute paradox of IT troubleshooting.
How do you mean?
Well, we spent the last half hour discussing machines capable of executing billions of calculations every single second, governed by a microscopic cryptographic vaults and 64-bit mathematical arrays. And yet, the very first step to fixing a totally dead PC, according to the official IT training curriculum, is literally a check-the-wall outlet.
It feels humbling, perhaps even insultingly simple, but it is scientifically necessary.
Is it really the first thing you check?
Always. When you are troubleshooting a complex system, you must eliminate the variables starting from the absolute source. You cannot diagnose a complex internal power distribution failure if the circuit breaker in your house tripped and the wall socket is dead.
The methodology in the sources is very strict. First, check the wall outlet. They actually say plug a lamp into it and see if the lamp turns on.
A simple foolproof test.
Next, check the power strip, or the surge protector. Then, physically inspect the thick black power cables for cuts or crimps. After that, make sure the physical rocker switch on the back of the power supply unit, the PSU, is actually flipped to the line symbol for on, not the circle symbol for off.
Which happens more often than you'd think.
Oh, I have definitely done that after moving a desk. I panicked for 10 minutes before I realized the switch was flipped. But if all of that external power checks out, the outline suggests using a dedicated PSU tester to see if the power supply itself has internally failed. Why is the PSU so vulnerable? Why does it fail so often?
Because the power supply unit is the primary shield for the rest of the machine. It performs a violent and highly stressful electrical conversion every second it's on.
Violent? In what way?
The electricity coming out of your wall socket is alternating current, or AC power. It flows in a massive fluctuating sine wave, often at 120 or 240 volts.
Right.
The delicate microchips on your motherboard, however, require direct current, or DC power, delivered in perfectly flat, incredibly stable, microscopic trickle voltages, usually exactly 3.3 volts, 5 volts, or 12 volts.
That is a massive step down in power.
It requires heavy capacitors, transformers, and coils. The PSU takes the raw, chaotic energy of the local power grid and forces it into a perfectly smooth line. Consequently, it bears the brunt of every single power spike, brownout, and electrical surge that hits your home.
It's taken the hits.
A high-quality PSU is intentionally designed with sacrificial components. If a massive lightning strike surges through your power lines, the capacitors inside the PSU are designed to violently pop and break the circuit. It intentionally destroys the power supply to prevent that lethal voltage from reaching the $1,000 processor on the motherboard.
Wow, it literally jumps on the electrical grenade.
Exactly, which is why testing the PSU is a primary step. The computer might be dead simply because the power supply did exactly what it was designed to do. Die to save the system.
Okay, Let's assume the power supply is healthy. The AC is converted to DC, the 12 volts travel down the thick, braided cables, and the power hits the motherboard. This electrical strike triggers a microscopic sequence called POST, P-O-S-T, Power On Self-Test.
This is the most critical handshake in the entire boot process.
Mm.
The POSD is a diagnostic routine permanently burned into the firmware.
How exactly does that sequence play out? The user just presses the button. What is the motherboard doing in that fraction of a second?
Well, when you press the power button on the front of the case, you are sending a momentary signal to the motherboard. The motherboard then sends a signal to the PSU saying, turn fully on.
Okay.
Once the PSU stabilizes its voltage, it sends a highly specific electrical signal back to the motherboard down a specific wire. This signal is literally called power good.
I'm awake and my voltages are stable.
Yes. The moment the CPU receives that power good signal, the internal clock crystal begins to pulse, and the CPU immediately reaches out to the UEFI firmware chip and executes the POST program.
And what is the PST looking for?
The POST acts as a rapid-fire attendance sheet. The CPU checks its own internal registers. Then it sends a signal to the first 64 kilobytes of the system RAM to see if memory exists.
Just checking if it's there.
Right. If the RAM replies, it sends a signal out the PCIe lanes to check for a video card. It checked the USB headers for a keyboard.
It's verifying that all the critical organs are present and functioning. And if everything is there and the voltages are correct, the system usually gives you that satisfying single short beep from the internal speaker, the screen flickers to life, and the boot sequence continues.
A very comforting sound.
But our material dedicates a very significant amount of time to diagnosing the nightmare scenario, the no-post condition.
A no-post scenario is where diagnostic skills are truly tested.
This is the situation where you have power. The fans are spinning loudly, the RGB lights on your motherboard are glowing beautifully, but the screen remains entirely black and there are no beeps. The computer is receiving electricity, but it lacks the cognitive ability to even complete the attendance sheet. It is essentially brain dead.
It's stuck in limbo.
The diagnostic steps for a no-post are fascinating because they rely almost entirely on physical manipulation. First, the outline suggests asking what changed recently. Did you physically move the computer case? Did you just install a new stick of RAM?
Physical disruption is the #1 suspect.
Then check all internal data and power cables. But the next step is the one that always raises eyebrows. The instructions say to reseat the RAM and the GPU. And by reseat, they mean physically open the machine, pull the memory sticks and the graphics card completely out of their slots, and vigorously shove them back in until the plastic retention clips click.
It does feel a bit brute force.
Right. On the surface, this sounds absolutely absurd. We are talking about highly sensitive microelectronics, and the official fix is essentially unplug it and plug it back in physically. Why does something this sophisticated respond to being scraped in and out of a plastic slot?
It seems crude, but it is deeply rooted in metallurgy and the physical environment inside the computer case.
Metallurgy.
Yes. Let's focus on a stick of RAM. If you look at the bottom of a RAM module, you will see a row of tiny gold-plated contact pins. Gold is used because it is highly conductive and highly resistant to corrosion.
Makes sense.
However, those pins slide into a plastic slot on the motherboard containing tiny metal receptors, usually made of a copper alloy.
Okay, two different metals meeting.
Yes. Now consider the environment. When you turn your computer on to play a high-end video game, the interior ambient temperature might rise to 45 or 50 degrees Celsius. When you turn it off at night, it cools back down to room temperature, say 20 degrees.
So it's heating up and cooling down constantly.
This drastic thermal cycling happens every single day. The materials, the plastic slot, the fiberglass circuit board, the metal pins, all expand and contract at microscopic, slightly different rates.
Thermal expansion?
Exactly. Over months and years, this constant microscopic shifting can literally wiggle a stick of RAM a fraction of a millimeter out of its seated position. It's an industry term called fretting.
Fretting, okay.
Furthermore, while the gold pins resist corrosion, the copper alloy receptors in the slot do not. The fretting movement exposes microscopic layers of the base metal to oxygen and humidity in the air, creating a microscopic layer of oxidation, essentially electrical rust.
And rust doesn't conduct electricity well.
Rust is an insulator. So the tiny electrical signals trying to travel from the processor to the memory hit a microscopic wall of oxidation. The POST sequence fails because the CPU cannot clearly communicate with the RAM.
Oh, wow.
When you pull that stick of RAM completely out and physically push it back into the tight slot, The friction of that movement mechanically scrapes away the invisible layer of oxidation, shearing it off and reestablishing clean metal-to-metal electrical contact.
That is incredible. It is not digital magic. It is literally just scraping the rust off the battery terminals of your car, but on a microscopic scale.
Exactly the same principle.
Okay, but what if reseating the components doesn't solve the no-peepos? The outline moves to the next major step, clearing the CMOS to reset the BIOS settings. It suggests doing this by jumping 2 specific pins on the motherboard or by physically removing the little silver coin-sized button battery located on the board.
The CMOS battery.
Now, I've seen that little watch battery on motherboards before. What is it actually doing, and what is physically happening when we pull it out to fix a frozen computer?
To understand this, we have to look at how the motherboard stores the specific settings you choose. When you go into the UEFI and set a custom fan curve, or disable the USB ports, or change the boot order, that information isn't saved on your main hard drive.
It's not on the SSD.
No, it is saved on a tiny memory chip on the motherboard. Historically, this chip was made using complementary metal oxide semiconductor technology, which is why it is still referred to as the CMOS.
Okay, so it's a dedicated memory chip just for the firmware settings.
Yes, but crucially, this specific type of memory is volatile memory.
Meaning it forgets everything if it loses power.
Exactly. Like your system RAM, volatile memory requires a continuous, uninterrupted trickle of direct electrical current to retain its data. If the power stops flowing, the electrons dissipate and the memory goes completely blank.
Okay.
When your computer is plugged into the wall, the power supply provides that trickle voltage. But what happens when you unplug the computer to move it to a new desk or the power goes out in your house?
The volatile memory would wipe itself. You'd lose your settings.
Which would mean you would lose all your custom hardware configurations every single time you unplug the machine. To prevent this, motherboard manufacturers include that CR2032 lithium button battery. It provides just enough microvoltage to keep the CMOS memory alive when the main power is severed.
So it's basically life support for the settings.
That is a perfect description. Now let's tie this back to a no-post-ease scenario. Let's say a user goes into the UEFI and attempts to aggressively overclock their system RAM, pushing it to run at a speed much faster than it was originally designed for.
Right, trying to squeeze out more performance.
The user saves the setting and restarts. The computer attempts to post. The CPU tries to communicate with the RAM at that highly aggressive new speed. The RAM completely fails to respond, and the system completely locks up.
It crashes before it can even turn on.
Yes. And because it crashes before it can load the UEFI menu again, the user's locked out. They can't go back in to fix the setting they just broke. The system is trapped in an endless loop, trying to apply a toxic setting every time it powers on.
So how does the battery fix it?
By unplugging the computer from the wall and physically removing that coin battery for 30 seconds, you sever the life support. You intentionally starve that volatile memory chip of electricity.
You kill the power.
The chip develops total amnesia. The toxic overclocking setting dissipates into nothingness. When you put the battery back in and restore power, the motherboard wakes up, realizes its memory is blank, and automatically reverts to the factory default guaranteed safe settings permanently hard-coded into a separate ROM chip.
Wow. You are intentionally inducing brain damage to make it forget why it was crashing, forcing it to rebuild its memory from a clean slate.
It is a brutal but highly effective physical reset.
The final step the outline provides for a stubborn, no POST scenario, like if clearing the CMOS and reseating everything fails, is what I like to call the medically induced coma test.
The bare bones test.
Right. The material instructs the technician to test with minimal hardware. You are supposed to disconnect every single hard drive, unplug all the USB devices, the mouse, the keyboard, remove the massive expensive graphics card. You strip the entire system down until you are booting with nothing but the processor, one single stick of memory in the primary slot, and a monitor plugged directly into the motherboard's basic onboard video port.
It is the ultimate exercise in isolating variables. You are stripping away all the secondary appendages and luxury features to determine if the core organs, the heart and the brain, can sustain life on their own.
Exactly. If you strip it down to the absolute bare minimum and you press the power button and it suddenly POSTs and gives you a happy beep, you instantly know that your motherboard and your CPU are perfectly fine.
The core is healthy.
The failure was caused by one of the components you removed. Then you become methodical. You add the second stick of RAM back in and test. If it posts, the RAM is good. You add the graphics card,
and test. If it suddenly goes back to a black screen and no PSO, you have instantly isolated the exact point of failure. The graphics card is dead.
It is a scientific method applied directly to silicon. Hypothesis, isolation, testing, and conclusion.
It is so incredibly satisfying when you finally find the culprit. So let's transition our focus. We have traversed a massive portion of the chain. You've checked the wall outlet. The PSU is delivering clean DC power. The CPU executes the post. The RAM is securely seated. The contacts are clean. And the motherboard gives you that beautiful single beep of approval.
The handoff is complete.
The firmware gatekeeper is satisfied, and it hands control over to your storage drive to load the operating system. But what happens when the very place your data lives, the drive itself, starts to fail?
This is where things get serious.
This brings us to the final major diagnostic category, the ticking clock. We are diving into disk troubleshooting and catastrophic system crashes.
This is traditionally where user anxiety really peaks. A dead power supply can be replaced for $50. A dead stick of RAM is an inconvenience. But a failing storage drive threatens the permanent loss of personal data. The family photographs, the financial tax records, the creative projects.
The CompTIA sources outline the first major roadblock in this category, drive not detected. You turn the computer on, it passes the postie, but instead of the Windows logo spinning, you get a stark black screen with white text that says, bootable device not found, or insert boot media and press any key.
A heart-stopping message.
Truly. The outline suggests a tiered approach here. First, verify the physical connections. If it's a traditional hard drive or an older SSD, check the SATA data cables and the SATA power cables. If it's an NVMe drive, check the seating on the motherboard.
Physical checks first, always.
Now, I want to pause here to clarify something for the listener. Because the physical landscape of storage has changed dramatically, what is the actual difference between checking a SATA connection and checking an NVMe connection?
It is a massive difference in both physical form and data pathways. SATA, which stands for Serial Advanced Technology Attachment, is the older standard. A SATA drive is usually a distinct physical box, either a 3.5-inch metal brick for a hard drive or a 2.5-inch plastic square for an older SSD.
Right, they take up physical space in the case.
It requires two distinct cables connecting it to the system. A wide cable running to the power supply for electricity, and a flat data cable running to a SATA port on the motherboard.
So checking a SATA drive means making sure those cables haven't wiggled loose over time.
Yes. But SATA was originally designed for spinning mechanical drives. It has a strict speed limit because the data has to travel through a controller chip before it reaches the CPU. NVMe, which stands for Non-Volatile Memory Express, is the modern standard.
And they look completely different.
An NVMe drive doesn't look like a box at all. It looks like a piece of chewing gum made of green circuit board.
The modern little sticks of storage.
Exactly. And you don't use cables for them at all. An NVMe drive plugs directly into an M.2 slot, flat against the motherboard itself. The revolutionary aspect of NVMe is that it utilizes the PCIe bus, the Peripheral Component Interconnect Express.
What does that mean for speed?
It essentially taps directly into the high-speed data lanes that run straight to the processor. It bypasses the old SATA traffic controller completely.
It gives the storage drive a private, multi-lane superhighway directly to the brain of the computer.
Precisely. So when the outline says to check the NVMe seating, you aren't checking cables. You are unscrewing a tiny retaining screw, pulling the small stuck out, and pushing it back into the motherboard slot, much like we discussed with the system RAM, to ensure a perfect electrical connection on those microscopic pins.
Okay, so assuming the physical connections are solid, the outline says to boot back into our secret UEFI menu and check the storage list. See if the motherboard firmware can actually detect the physical presence of the drive. If the drive shows up in the UEFI list, but the computer still says bootable device not found, you have to verify the boot order.
The boot order is a very common culprit.
And this is a classic trap. Maybe you were transferring files yesterday, and you left a USB thumb drive plugged into the front of the case. When you turn the computer on, the UEFI might be configured to look at USB ports before it looks at the internal NVMe drive.
It's just following instructions.
It sees the thumb drive, stubbornly assumes that's where Windows is supposed to be, finds no operating system, and throws an error, completely ignoring your actual hard drive.
It is an incredibly common, frustrating, yet totally harmless mistake. The computer is simply following its assigned sequence too rigidly. You just unplug the USB drive and restart.
But the material also dives into the much darker territory. The symptoms of actual physical drive failure.
For traditional hard disk drives, the ones with the spinning magnetic platters, the symptoms listed include read-write failures, missing drives in the operating system, constant LED activity, which they call disk thrashing, and most notably, unusual clicking noises.
The sounds of mechanical death.
To combat this creeping failure, the industry relies on a built-in diagnostic tool called SMART, that stands for Self-Monitoring, Analysis, and Reporting Technology. It is a program embedded directly into the logic board of the drive itself that constantly monitors its own health and alerts the operating system to an impending failure.
It's an early warning system.
Now, this sounds great in theory, but I have to ask a serious question about the reality of this tech. If SMART technology is so supposedly smart, why do hard drives still seem to die on us completely out of nowhere? I've had drives fail instantly without a single warning top-up. Is SMART just giving us a false sense of security?
That is a highly perceptive critique of the technology. To understand why SMART fails to warn us, we must differentiate between two distinct types of failure: predictable mechanical degradation and catastrophic electronic or physical trauma.
Okay, let's break those down. What is predictable degradation?
SMART excels at measuring slow, gradual wear and tear. Let's look at the mechanics of a spinning hard drive. It has a spindle motor that must spin heavy metal platters up to a highly specific speed, usually 7,200 revolutions per minute.
Fast.
The SMART sensors constantly measure the exact number of milliseconds it takes for that motor to reach 7,200 RPM when you turn the power on.
Oh, like timing a car going from 0 to 60?
Exactly. When the drive is brand new, it might take, say, 2.1 seconds. But over 3 years of use, the microscopic fluid dynamic bearings inside that motor begin to wear down. The friction increases. SMART notices that it now takes 3.4 seconds, then 4.1 seconds to reach operating speed.
So it's tracking the struggle.
It also monitors the magnetic surface of the platters. If the read-write head struggles to read a specific magnetic sector and has to try 3 or 4 times to decipher the data, SMART records that hesitation. If those error rates and spin-up times slowly climb past a predefined threshold over weeks and months, the logic board trips a SMART alert.
And what does that look like?
The next time you boot, the UEFI reads that alert and throws a massive warning on your screen telling you to back up your data immediately because the drive is dying of old age.
It sees the slow decline. It measures the physical exhaustion.
Yes. But what SMART is completely incapable of predicting is a sudden catastrophic failure. It cannot predict if a massive power surge is going to bypass your PSU and instantly fry the tiny controller chip on the back of the hard drive.
Or physical damage.
And most devastatingly, it cannot predict a sudden head crash.
A head crash. Is that related to the unusual clicking noises the outline mentions as a symptom?
Intimately related. Inside a traditional hard drive, the actuator arm, the metal arm holding the microscopic read-write heads, does not actually touch the spinning magnetic platters.
It doesn't touch.
No, it floats on a microscopic cushion of air generated by the rotational speed of the disks. The gap between the head and the data is measured in nanometers. It is thinner than a human hair, thinner than a fingerprint smudge.
So it's flying just barely above the surface.
Yes. Now, if the drive receives a sudden physical shock, say you slam your fist on your desk in frustration while the drive is writing data, or you accidentally kick your computer tower, that microscopic cushion of air is disrupted. The read-write head violently slaps into the surface of the magnetic platter, spinning at 7,200 RPM.
Oh, that sounds disastrous.
It physically gouges the magnetic material, instantly destroying the data in that location and creating a cloud of microscopic metallic dust inside the sealed chamber.
Just destroying itself.
The logic board on the drive immediately realizes it can no longer read the data track, so it initiates an emergency recalibration. It aggressively pulls the actuator arm all the way back to its starting position at the edge of the disk, resetting it.
Trying to fix it.
Then, it attempts to read the data again. The arm swings out, hits the damaged sector, fails, and forcefully pulls back again.
Swing out, fail, pull back.
Over and over again in rapid succession. The physical sound of that metal arm violently hitting its internal stopping block as it resets is the repetitive clicking noise you hear. In the IT industry, it is universally known as the click of death.
That is a terrifying mechanical reality.
And this is why SMART fails you in this scenario. SMART cannot warn you about a head crash beforehand, because the event is instantaneous. And once the crash happens, the physical mechanism required to transmit the SMART warning to the motherboard is already destroyed. The drive is functionally dead before it can even scream for help.
Which reinforces the golden rule. SMART is a useful diagnostic metric, but it is
absolutely not a substitute for a rigorous automated backup strategy. You have to back up your data.
You absolutely must.
Now, the final symptom of system failure detailed in the sources is arguably the most famous, most culturally recognized error screen in computing history, the BSOD, the blue screen of death.
The ultimate sign of systemic distress at the software layer.
The outline provides a methodology for troubleshooting a BSOD. It instructs the user to note the specific hexadecimal error code the screen spits out. It gives two specific examples, memory management and driver equal not less or equal.
ASIC codes.
Then it suggests rebooting the computer into safe mode again, using that advanced startup trick we discussed earlier to isolate drivers, run memory diagnostics, or check the disk for corruption. But I have to be honest, when I am working on a crucial document and a blue screen of death suddenly violently replaces my work, it feels like the computer is attacking me.
It feels very personal.
It feels like a massive hostile failure that just wiped out an hour of my effort for no reason.
I completely understand that emotional reaction. It is deeply frustrating. But analytically, we need to completely reframe how we view the blue screen of death. If we dive into the underlying architecture of the Windows kernel, the BSOD is not an enemy. It is not an attack.
What is it then?
It is the computer's final, heroic act of self-preservation.
Self-preservation. How is crashing my computer and losing my unsaved Word document saving the machine?
Because of what is happening at the deepest levels of memory allocation. To understand this, let's look closely at the second specific error code mentioned in your sources.
Yeah.
Driver oracle not less or equal.
Okay, let's break that down.
IRQL stands for interrupt request level. Your CPU is constantly multitasking, managing thousands of requests from different pieces of hardware. To manage the chaos, it uses a strict hierarchy of interrupts. A mouse click is a low-level interrupt. A signal from the system timer or the memory controller is a high-level interrupt.
So it's a priority queue for the processor.
Exactly. Now, imagine your operating system's kernel is a highly meticulous librarian. The librarian's job is to organize millions of books, which represents your active data on massive bookshelves, which represents your physical RAM.
Okay, I like this. A strict librarian.
Let's say you update the software driver for your graphics card, and that new driver contains a tiny hidden bug in its code. While you are working on your Word document, that buggy graphics driver suddenly sends a high-level interrupt request to the CPU, demanding access to a highly restricted section of memory that it does not have the authority to touch.
Uh-oh.
Or worse, the driver attempts to physically overwrite a block of RAM that currently holds the core operating instructions for Windows itself.
Chaos in the library. A rogue patron is trying to burn the reference section.
Total chaos. Now, if Windows were designed to just politely ignore that illegal action and try to keep running just to save your Word document,
Right.
the consequences would be catastrophic.
How bad?
The rogue driver might successfully overwrite the kernel's memory. The operating system would become instantly corrupted. It might then write that corrupted, mangled data back down to your physical hard drive, permanently destroying system files and rendering the entire computer permanently unbootable. It could cause a cascade of logical destruction.
It would let the infection spread just to avoid inconveniencing the user.
Exactly. To prevent that cascade of corruption, the Windows kernel is programmed with a global stop protocol. The moment it detects that an illegal memory access has occurred, the moment that IRQL rule is broken, it throws a kernel panic.
Shuts it all down.
It intentionally and violently halts every single running process instantly. It freezes the memory state, throws up the blue screen to alert the user, and immediately dumps the contents of the RAM into a log file before the corruption can spread to the hard drive. It literally sacrifices your unsaved Word document to protect the fundamental integrity of your operating system.
Wow, so the BSOD is basically jumping on a grenade to save the hard drive.
Precisely. It is an emergency lockdown. And crucially, it leaves you a precise map of the battlefield before it dies.
The error code.
That specific hexadecimal error code, driver error QL, is a coordinate. It tells the diagnostic technician exactly which rule was broken. By parsing the memory dump file it creates, you can pinpoint the exact rogue driver that caused the conflict.
And this is where the outline's suggestion to use safe mode becomes so powerful. By rebooting into safe mode, you are instructing Windows to load only the absolute bare minimum of generic Microsoft drivers required to put an image on the screen. It intentionally blocks the third-party graphics driver, the audio driver, the network driver from loading into memory.
It's the software equivalent of stripping the motherboard down to one stick of RAM.
Exactly. It is the exact same philosophy of isolation, just applied to code instead of silicon.
If the computer boots perfectly into safe mode and remains stable for hours, you've instantly isolated the problem. You immediately know your physical RAM is fine, your hard drive is healthy, and the motherboard is intact.
The hardware is innocent.
Right. The problem is a bad software update, which you can now safely uninstall while in safe mode, restoring the system to perfect health. Troubleshooting, at every single layer of the machine, is simply the methodical process of removing variables until the truth reveals itself.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it.
Okay, looking back, we have covered an absolute mountain of diagnostic ground today. We have followed the chain of command from the very spark of electricity. We started at the physical wall outlet, ensuring clean DC power reaches the board. We forced our way through the invisible high-speed gateway of the UEFI firmware, bypassing the modern fast boot sequences to assert control.
We explored the mathematical boundaries of computing history, contrasting the 32-bit limitations of the legacy BIOS and MBR with the expansive 64-bit architecture of UEFI and GPT, which revolutionized our storage capacity and introduced vital map redundancy.
We examined the intense militarization of the motherboard, analyzing how secure boot intercepts Ring 0 rootkits, and how TPM 2.0 acts as a soldered microscopic vault to protect cryptographic keys and ensure hardware attestation. We even learned how to physically deaden a USB port to stop corporate espionage.
We applied thermodynamics to fan curves. We diagnosed the chemical reality of a degrading CMS battery causing volatile memory amnesia, and we utilized metallurgy to explain why physically scraping a stick of RAM fixes a no-post failure.
And finally, we faced the ticking clock of storage failure. We differentiated the PCIe superhighway of NVMe from the older SATA lanes. We analyzed the mechanical terror of an actuator arm causing the click of death, and we completely reframed the blue screen of death, transforming it from a frustrating crash into a heroic act of software self-preservation.
It's a comprehensive look at the entire system.
Armed with this deep dive into the CompTIA A Core material, I truly feel like we have successfully built that X-ray machine. We have given the listener the analytical toolkit of a seasoned IT professional.
The chain of command is entirely visible now. Every failure has a location, and every location has a logical fix. But before we close out this session, there is a provocative, perhaps slightly concerning thought that this material brings to mind, specifically concerning the trajectory of the hardware industry.
Oh, a shift in the landscape. Where are we headed?
Consider the diagnostic methodologies we just spent an hour detailing. Reseating a stick of RAM to clear oxidation, pulling a physical CMOS battery to clear the firmware amnesia, upgrading a failing SATA hard drive, utilizing a dedicated physical TPM chip.
All the physical fixes.
Every single one of these highly effective troubleshooting steps relies entirely on a foundational concept: the physical modularity of the personal computer, the ability to open the box and interact with discrete components.
Right.
But the consumer electronics industry is shifting aggressively away from modularity. In the relentless pursuit of making laptops thinner, lighter, and more aesthetically pleasing, manufacturers are increasingly soldering components directly onto the main motherboard.
And making them permanent.
In many premium laptops today, you cannot reseat the RAM because it is permanently fused to the board. You cannot swap the storage drive because the NAND flash chips are soldered next to the processor.
So you can't fix them.
Simultaneously, we are moving heavily toward a cloud computing paradigm. We are seeing a rise in devices that are essentially just thin clients, machines with minimal local storage and processing power, relying entirely on a constant internet connection to run applications on a massive server farm hundreds of miles away.
Right, the terminal model. The device in your hand is just a window to the actual computer.
Exactly. So the question we have to ponder as we look at this incredible diagnostic knowledge base is this: as the hardware industry systematically strips away the physical modularity of our devices, what happens to user agency?
That's a huge question.
If the RAM cannot be reseated and the storage cannot be accessed and the UEFI is locked behind a cloud-managed administrative wall, are we losing the ability to troubleshoot our own machines?
It certainly seems that way.
In 10 years, will the average user even have a physical gateway to tinker with? Or will the personal computer complete its transition into a completely sealed, impenetrable glass and aluminum black box where our only diagnostic option when it experiences a failure is to throw the entire machine in the recycling bin and buy a new one?
The loss of the right to repair.
We're gaining unprecedented convenience and form factor, but we are sacrificing the fundamental right and the physical ability to repair our own tools.
That is a deeply chilling thought for anyone who likes to understand how their world works. We might be sitting at the very end of an era. We might be the last generation of users who are actually allowed to look under the hood and understand the physical mechanisms of the machines that run our lives.
It's certainly a possibility we have to prepare for.
And that really brings this entire discussion full circle. We wanted to build an X-ray machine for your computer today. We wanted to give you the ability to see that jagged white line, to isolate the variables, and to confidently point at the problem and say, there it is. Because once you understand the physics, the math, and the logic behind the error, the panic fades. The impenetrable magic box becomes just a machine again. And machines, well, they can be fixed. At least for now.
For now, yes.
Thanks for joining us on today's deep dive into the hardware chain of command. We will see you next time.